sleeping on a straw-stuffed mattress in a cramped hut, with no coffee, no phone, no grocery store to bail you out. Life is hard, brutal even, but you're not helpless. You've got your wits, your hands, and the land around you. How do you survive? Not just scrape by, but thrive with no money, no machines, and no safety net. That's what we're exploring today on Boring History, where we turn the dusty past into a story that grabs you by the collar and doesn't let go. We're diving into 15 forgotten survival tricks medieval peasants used. Tricks so clever, so practical, they still work today. So, grab a seat by the fire, because we're about to step into a world where every day was a masterclass in human ingenuity. Let's start with the most basic need, food. Your stomach's growling, and there's no market or delivery app in sight. Medieval peasants didn't have fancy kitchens and metal pots. Those were for lords and ladies. So, what did you do if you caught a fish or snared a rabbit? You looked to the earth. Picture yourself by a stream, a fire crackling nearby, and a pile of smooth, dry stones, granite maybe, hauled from the hills. You toss those stones into the flames until they glow red-hot. Then carefully drop them into a wooden bowl or a leather bag filled with water. Suddenly, the water hisses and bubbles like a witch's cauldron. You're boiling water without a pot, cooking soup or sterilizing drinking water with nothing but rocks and fire. This wasn't just a neat trick. It was a lifeline for peasants who couldn't afford iron. The stones had to be chosen with care, though. River rocks were a hard pass. Why? They trap moisture inside, and when heated, they can explode like a medieval firecracker. Nobody wanted rock shards in their stew or an awkward chat with their spouse about why dinner's now a disaster. Dry, solid rocks from higher ground. Boiling water killed germs. Peasants didn't know about bacteria, but they noticed fewer folks got sick when they bubbled their water with fire-roasted stones. Trial and error was their laboratory, and survival was their PhD. But boiling wasn't the only way to cook. Sometimes you needed to roast or bake, and peasants had another trick up their sleeve. Clay. Imagine you've got a fish, still scaly, or a chicken, feathers and all. No knife, no pan, just a pile of fresh clay by the riverbank. You mix it with water until it's thick and sticky, then slather it over your catch. Feathers, scales, and all until it's completely encased. You toss this muddy bundle onto a bed of hot coals and wait. The clay hardens, trapping heat and steam, turning your meal into something tender and juicy. When it's done, you crack open the shell, and here's the magic. The clay peels away fur, feathers, or scales, leaving perfectly cooked meat, locking in flavors and juices better than any modern gadget. Root vegetables like turnips or carrots came out rich and deep, their flavors intensified by the gentle, even heat. Clay cooking wasn't foolproof, though. You needed the right kind of clay, pure enough to hold together, sticky enough to form a solid shell. Get it wrong, and your dinner could crumble into ash or taste like dirt. But when it worked, it was a game changer. Some families got so good at it, their neighbors started placing orders like it was a medieval food truck. Hey, can you clay bake me a rabbit for Sunday? Word spread when your dinner came wrapped in mud but tasted like heaven. And you've got a pig you slaughtered or a haul of vegetables from the harvest. How do you make it last? Salt was the answer, and it was worth its weight in gold. Literally, some peasants worked for salt instead of coins, which is why we still say someone earns their salt when they do good work. Salt wasn't just seasoning. It was survival in crystal form. By packing meat in coarse sea salt or rock salt, peasants drew out moisture through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. A single pig, properly salted, could feed a family through the winter, assuming nobody got greedy and ate the good bits in the first week. The salt crust hardened around the meat like armor, tough to break but worth it when fresh food was months away. Entire villages sometimes shared salt storage, forming cooperatives to pool resources. Wars were fought over salt sources. That's how serious this was. Properly salted meat could last 6 months or more, getting richer and tastier over time, like modern cured meats. Not bad for a survival tactic. But salt wasn't the only way to preserve food. Smoke was another weapon in the peasants' arsenal. Walk into a medieval home. Peasants turned attics, huts, or loft spaces into smokehouses, keeping low fires burning to produce steady streams of smoke. Oak gave a mild, sweet flavor. Hickory packed a punch for fattier cuts. Smoking wasn't quick. It could take days or weeks for larger pieces, but it was worth it. The meat developed a dark, protective crust that kept out insects, bacteria, and moisture, while staying tender inside. Smoked meat could last months, and the smoke kept flies away, making it a medieval multitasker. Families had their own secret recipes, passed down like heirlooms, blending with choice, fire management, and timing to turn basic meat into a delicacy. These tricks, hot stones, clay cooking, salt, and smoke, weren't just about getting by. They were about making life better, tastier, and safer with nothing but what the land provided. But food's only part of the puzzle. How do you keep it fresh, find clean water, or stay healthy when the world's against you? Let's keep walking through this village and find out. You're still in that smoky hut, the fire casting shadows on the wattle and daub walls. Winter's closing in, and you've got your salted meat and smoked fish. But how do you make sure they don't spoil before spring? And what about water? Medieval peasants invented natural refrigerators by creating root cellars, holes in the ground that used the earth's chill to keep food fresh. The trick was digging below the frost line. They were built with care. Walls were lined with stones to prevent cave-ins, and floors were covered with sand or gravel for drainage, keeping moisture from ruining your stash. Some peasants got so good at this, their neighbors hired them to build cellars like medieval contractors installing custom closets. Root cellars weren't just for veggies. Butter, cheese, milk, even jars of preserves or cured meats went down there. Some were built into hillsides for extra insulation, making them even more stable. A well-made cellar could keep food fresh from fall to spring, meaning the difference between a cozy winter and chewing on tree bark by February. Imagine pulling out a crisp carrot in March, knowing your planning paid off. That's the kind of victory that fueled these folks through tough times. But food storage only works if you've got something to store, and water was just as critical. Clean water wasn't guaranteed. Streams could be fouled by animals or runoff, and wells weren't always nearby. So peasants turned to the sky. But it beat drinking from a stream where cows did their business. Smart families placed barrels to catch water from multiple roof sections, building reserves that could last weeks during dry spells. Some even buried barrels partway underground to keep water cool and prevent freezing. Rainwater was often cleaner than well or stream water, and this system was a masterclass in working with what you had. Now let's talk health. Someone in your hut's coughing, and there's no pharmacy or WebMD. What do? Peasants turned to their gardens. Onions and garlic were their go-to remedies. Sliced onions were left in sick rooms, and while they thought these pulled sickness from the air, a natural antimicrobial, they didn't know the science, but they saw wounds heal better with garlic, and that was enough. For coughs or sore throats, they mixed onion syrup with honey. Tasted awful, but honey killed bacteria, and onions reduced swelling and mucus. This was a medicine cabinet grown in your garden, cheap and effective. Some even wore garlic necklaces to ward off illness. It didn't work, but it probably kept nosy neighbors at bay, which is a win in my book. These remedies weren't just for humans. Peasants used plants to protect their food, too. Rats and mice were a constant threat, nibbling through grain or meat stores. But rodents have sensitive noses, and peasants exploited that. They sprinkled chili powder, black pepper, mustard, and most animals gave up fast. Hanging kept food off the ground, away from climbers, and some peasants added bells or gourds to make noise if something tried to sneak a bite. Nettles were free, renewable, and even edible later, making them a Swiss Army knife of plants. With food and water secured, and health covered, how did peasants face the darkest times, like famine or freezing winters? But it kept entire communities alive. The secret was the inner bark, called cambium, a thin layer between the rough outer bark and the wood, packed with sugars and nutrients. Birch and pine were the go-to trees, with birch being the tastier option. Harvesting was delicate. You peeled the outer bark and scraped the cambium without killing the tree. Slow, careful work, but worth it when starvation was knocking. Fresh cambium was bitter and chewy, so peasants dried it thoroughly, then ground it into coarse flour. This was mixed with regular grain flour to make bread, sometimes up to a third bark in tough times. The result was dense, chewy, and bitter, but it filled bellies. Kids griped, but parents reminded them complaining was a luxury. Birch bark was milder, while pine had more vitamin C, fighting scurvy. Some families added honey, fat, or dried berries to mask the taste. Bark bread wasn't gourmet, but it was survival. Nettle beer and dandelion wine were their answer to hard times. Nettles, those stinging garden pests, were boiled with water and sweetened with honey, tree sap, or dried fruits. Wild yeast or saved yeast kicked off fermentation, and after a week or two you had a low-alcohol drink that took the edge off. Dandelion wine used the bright yellow flowers, so common even the poorest families could make batches. These drinks were kept mild, just enough to preserve the liquid and relax you, not to cause trouble. Nettles are loaded with iron, vitamin C, and calcium. Dandelions have vitamin A and potassium. This was a medieval multivitamin that tasted good. Families had their own recipes, tossing in mint or sage for flavor, and these drinks could last months, boosting health and spirits. Warmth was another challenge. Winter in a drafty hut was no joke, and firewood wasn't always plentiful. Peasants stuffed cloth sacks with clean, dry straw to make mattresses that cushioned and insulated. Straw trapped air, acting like medieval memory foam, keeping you off the cold floor. Families slept head to toe, sharing body heat in tight quarters. They also heated large stones by the fire, wrapped them in rags, and tucked them under blankets as hot water bottles, keeping beds warm for hours. Windows and doors were covered with thick cloths or tapestries to block drafts, and fresh straw from wheat or barley made all the difference. Smart families rotated old straw to the compost pile and refilled mattresses, keeping things fresh. Fuel was tougher. Wood was great, but forests weren't always nearby. So, peasants turned to something every farm had: dung. Cow and horse dung, shaped into flat patties and dried in the sun, became fuel cakes that burned slowly and steadily. Unlike straw or twigs, dung gave consistent heat, perfect for cooking or warming a room. Drying was key. Wet dung smoldered and stank, but dry patties burned cleanly. Peasants laid them out in rows, sometimes on raised platforms, watching the weather like hawks. A sudden rain could ruin weeks of work. Dry dung was stored in sheds or built into house walls for insulation, pulling double duty. Cow dung was the best, burning longer and cleaner than horse dung. It was free, renewable, and delivered daily by your livestock. Talk about sustainable. With these tricks, peasants were ready for almost anything. But how did they handle winter's worst and make the most of every scrap? Let's keep going. Winter's in full swing now, snow piling up outside your hut. You've got food, water, and a warm bed. But the cold is relentless, and resources are stretched thin. How do you keep your home warm when firewood's running low? What do you do with the ashes from your fire? Peasants had answers that'll make you rethink what waste means. Let's start with snow. Most of the year it was a pain, blocking paths, freezing water troughs, making life harder. But peasants realized it could insulate their homes like a thermal blanket. By packing fresh snow against the outside walls, they slashed heat loss by up to 50%. Snow's full of trapped air, a fantastic insulator, keeping warmth in and cold out. It was like nature delivering free siding every blizzard. Building snow walls wasn't just shoveling. They had to pack the snow just right. Too loose, and it crumbled. Too tight, and it lost its air pockets. Powdery snow was best for insulation but tricky to shape, while wet snow held better but was heavier. Peasants layered it like sculptors, patching gaps from wind or animals. Some villages had snowpacking days, where neighbors teamed up to insulate each other's homes. It saved firewood, and in a world where every log counted, that was huge. But it worked. Ash was sprinkled over food scraps, latrines, or chamber pots to kill odors and keep flies away, like a medieval air freshener. In the pantry, a light dusting over grain created an alkaline barrier insects hated, protecting food without costly pest control. During winter, ash was even used in first aid. Peasants knew which wood gave the best ash and never wasted a pinch. Survival wasn't just about warmth and cleanliness. It was about stretching every resource. Nettles, beyond protecting food, were food. Boiled into soups or fermented into beer, they were a nutritional powerhouse. Dandelions went from garden pest to wine ingredient, their flowers turning into a drink that boosted health and morale. Straw, used for mattresses, was composted after it wore out, feeding the garden. Even fuel was diverse, dung was king, but peasants also burned straw, twigs, or peat, a bog soil that smoldered like coal. Peat was slow and steady, perfect for long nights, but took effort to cut and dry. Communities shared resources, salt, wood, labor, forming tight-knit systems where survival was a team effort. A family with extra salt might trade it for smoked meat. But what does it all mean for us, and how did they keep hope alive? Let's wrap this up. We've walked through this medieval village together, from smoky huts to snowy fields, and seen how peasants survived with nothing but grit and ingenuity. You've learned to cook with stones, preserve food, collect water, and stay warm. But what does it all add up to? Every hot stone, clay-wrapped fish, or salted barrel was a bet on tomorrow. Bark bread wasn't just famine food. It was a promise that even when fields failed, the forest could feed you. Nettle beer and dandelion wine were reminders that joy could bloom in the weeds. Snow walls, straw mattresses, dung fuel, these were acts of defiance against a world that didn't care if you lived or died. Each trick was a small victory, proof that human creativity could outsmart hunger, cold, and sickness. What strikes me most is how peasants worked with their environment. They didn't fight nature. They listened to it. Rain became drinking water, snow became insulation, ash became soap. They knew their land, the right clay, the best wood, the perfect cellar depth. This was knowledge earned through trial and error, passed down like a family recipe. Communities were key too. Salt cooperatives, shared smokehouses, group snowpacking, survival was collective. Your neighbor's success was your success, because a starving village helped no one. This interdependence feels distant in our world of apps and next-day delivery, but it's a reminder of what humans can do when we lean on each other. So what can we learn? These tricks still work. Boiling water with stones can save you camping. Clay cooking is making a comeback among outdoor chefs. Root cellars are eco-friendly for off-grid living. Nettle tea is trendy in health circles. But the real lesson is about constraints breeding creativity. Peasants had little, but that lack forced them to think harder, work smarter, value every scrap. In our throwaway culture, that mindset feels revolutionary. Picture that village one last time. Snow's falling, but the hut's warm, insulated by snow walls and heated by dung patties. Nettle soup simmers, turning dirt, weeds, and waste into life. Their story challenges us. What can we make with what we have? How can we face our winters with their courage? Thanks for joining me on Boring History. Subscribe, hit that bell, and drop a comment below. What's your favorite peasant trick? Tried any yourself? Let's keep uncovering the past's hidden brilliance together. Until next time, stay curious and maybe try boiling some water with a stone. You never know when it'll come in handy.